Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a mortise and tenon. And in this exercise, what we're going to do is just simply do a T like this. So we're going to create a tenon on one end and a mortise on the other end here. Some of the tools that you'll need for cutting a mortise and tenon are here on the bench. I've got a marking gauge. Actually, this is a mortising gauge. I use it, it's a marking / mortising gauge, and the only differentiation between those is you have the marking gauge, which has a single point right here, and the mortise gauge has 2 points, one of which is which slides. This one here, this point slides, making it adjustable to your different chisel widths. So this is the side we'll be using, the 2 points there. We'll also use a knife too, and a square for cutting our shoulders. Got a couple chisels. In this case, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch chisel and a 1 inch chisel, a mallet for striking the chisel, and a couple saws. I've got here a rip saw. This is a 14-inch rip saw, which I like to use for cutting the actual cheeks, because again, the cheek is going with the grain, so we're going to use the rip saw for going with the grain. You can use a dovetail saw, which is configured for rip, for going across the grain, that is cutting the shoulders, or you could use a crosscut saw. If you don't have a crosscut saw, you can use the dovetail saw. And the reason why you can is because the teeth are so small, and we're going to create a knife wall like we've done in the previous videos. So we'll create that knife wall, and you can use the dovetail saw. Or if you have a crosscut saw works great for cutting across the grain. I think I ought to start by just doing a little sketch and showing you what a tenon looks like, because that may help clarify some of the terminology that I'm going to use. I'm going to start by just drawing out a tenon to help illustrate some of the different parts of the tenon. So here's our piece here, and the tenon is this part coming off like this. So just a couple things to keep in mind here. What we have here, of course this is the grain running through like this, that's this piece like this. So this is going to be a through tenon, which would be determined by, of course, cutting the mortise, the hole to accept the tenon, cutting it all the way through, and then consequently making the tenon to fit that. But a couple things I want to point out here in regards to the terminology. This cut here is called the shoulder. That's this part right here. The cheek is this part here. So generally the cheek runs with the grain like this, okay, and then the shoulder is cut across the grain. So you have the shoulder, which is cut across the grain, and the cheek, which runs with the grain. So this is essentially how our tenon is going to look. So on to the layout here. What we're going to do is, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to create a T right here. So I'm going to start by marking the mortise width, which before we do that though, we've got to make some important marks, and that is we're going to mark the face mark. And the reason why this is really, really important is because I want to lay out everything from the face. So let's determine what the face is. Okay, so I've got this. Let's just call this the face right here. And again, if you've watched the previous videos, you know that this is just basically a cursive F denoting the outside face right here. So we've got that. That's the face. Now we've got to determine what is a square edge to that face, and this wood has been milled, machine milled, so it should be square. I can hold it up, and I see that it's nice and square. So I'm going to draw an arrow pointing to the face. That tells me that these two faces, both this face and this edge, are perfectly aligned, and those are my reference points. We're going to reference off of that. Let's check this one as well. Very important. This is really key here. If I don't do this, I could end up with when I was done, I could end up with an offset tenon. Like if I turn this over like this, it could be offset, and in this case, I don't want that. So I want it nice and flush here. Okay, nice and flush there. So let's just begin by marking this. We'll call this the mortise piece. I'm just going to mark 2 marks right there. And then we're going to take the width of this piece and just put it right on top like this, okay? And just put a little mark. Again, just a little mark because I'm going to use the square to mark that shoulder, okay? So we've got those 2 marks. We can carry those marks around to the other edge with our pencil. So I actually should be using the square off of the face, right? And then we're going to carry those lines around. Again, here's my edge. We've got the square. Always reference the square off of either the edge or the face. So there's our referenced edge there, and then our face. So I'm carrying these lines around, and these are going to denote the mortise. Okay, so that's the mortise width right there. And so my mortise is going to go right in here and right in there. Okay. Now this part here, which is going to be the tenon, you can see we put that on there. We put a little mark there. Now we're going to take the square and the knife, and we're going to carry that knife line all the way around. But again, it's important that we work off of the edge and the face. If I take the square and I go like this, and then like this, and then like this, now we're not off of the correct edge, and then here we work this around, we're not off of the same face, okay? If I do that, I can compound any errors as I work around the edge. If the board wasn't milled perfectly square, if it wasn't perfectly parallel or in both directions, we could compound any error, and our chances are our line would not line up when it got to the edge. That is if I worked it around like this. However, if I work off of 2 faces, this face and this edge, like this, like this, and like this, and like this, I've decreased the possible compounded errors by working off of just those 2 faces. So I'm going to take my knife, and right up there in that mark, we'll slide the square up to it, and making sure I'm off of that face. Are we on that face? We sure are, yep. So let's take the knife, slide it up to it, and lightly scribe across. We are scribing the shoulder, which, as I mentioned earlier, the shoulder defines the cross grain cut. And again, we use the knife for our cross grain cuts. Okay, now we're going to work it like this, across here, just like so. And then here, then there's our face right there, right? So we're going to bring this in, taking our knife right there, and right up at the corner, and carrying my square up to it, working that. Again, our square is referenced always on that face and that edge, and then we'll just come across here, and then the line should line up perfectly right there at the corner. And that's because we followed this pattern of working off of the face and the edge. The next step here is, once we've got that, is we've got to now set our gauge, and I'm going to set my mortise gauge here by sliding this pin over. I'll just use the chisel to push that over, and we'll slide it to the width of a 1/2 inch chisel, and that's just the width of the mortise that I've used. For most chairs, doors, and small doors and such, I'll use a 3/8 mortise and tenon. For larger objects, we can use a 1/2 inch. A workbench, I'll use a 3/4 or 1 inch mortise. But we're just going to slide this up to where the actual width of the chisel falls right there at the points. And again, we went over this in the video on cutting a dado, where we actually went over how to set the chisel on there right at the very point. So you can see I'm making it where it hits right at the point, and we've got that set. Now I'd like to explain why I use the chisel as opposed to just measuring it. We want it to be 1/2 inch. Well, suppose you're using a chisel that was 13 millimeter, which is slightly larger than a 1/2 inch. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're using a 13 millimeter chisel, a 12 millimeter chisel, or a 1/2 inch chisel. As long as you use whatever chisel you're using to create the mortise, you want to set that chisel to your gauge. It's more accurate that way. Or back in the day when chisels were hand forged, they might be a little bit off, a little bit bigger, a little smaller than a 1/2 inch, so or 3/8 or whatever measurement we're using. So that's why it's important to set the chisel to the actual points. So now what we're going to do is we're going to center this on the actual piece. It should be 3/8 of an inch over from the edge, and I could measure that with my rule here and just set it, and that should be 3/8. Again, I just set that right up to the point there. So it's 3/8 from the fence to that first point, and then 1/2 inch between those 2 points. Again, we're going to work from the outside face here, and we're going to scribe this. So put 2 points there and then scribe it. What I don't want to do is I don't want to flip this over and work off of the opposite face. I've got to turn this to where the fence is always working off of that same face, and the reason why is because if I'm a little bit off center here, at least those holes will be lined up perfectly straight. Same way here, I'm going to work off of this face right here because I want this tenon to be in line with this right here. And sometimes it's helpful to position this in a vise, just like so, and because you want to make sure that this cut is nice, this mark rather is nice and straight all the way across the top. So by stabilizing it with my left hand here, I can stabilize the gauge and make repetitive marks and make sure that it's nice and straight. We'll turn this like this. And again, the key here is light cuts, light, and then we'll go back heavier. So you see we're just going over this multiple times, making a defined line. So that concludes the layout of the mortise and tenon. We're now ready to chop the mortise. I'm going to start with a 1/2 inch chisel, the same chisel that I used to lay out the mortise with, and the wooden joiner's mallet. Proper stance is very important here, and you'll also notice that I have this clamped on the bench as opposed to in the vise. I don't want to do mortising in the vise because there's nothing supporting it underneath. When I start using the chisel, the forces are going to be directed straight down onto the workbench. So it's important that when you're mortising that the piece is clamped on the actual bench surface. Proper stance is also important. What I want to do here is I want to put my body up against the bench and align my body in such a fashion that I can see whether the chisel is 90 degrees, that is parallel with the side, perpendicular to the face of the bench. I usually spread my legs out where my left leg is forward, my right leg back. I can bend at the knees if I need to, and that provides a fairly comfortable stance. I'm going to start by holding the chisel like this. Now there's 2 methods for holding the chisel. One is what I call the precision grip, which is like this. This allows me to be able to precisely place the chisel right where I want to cut. There's also another grip that I refer to as the power grip, and that's where I'm holding it up here. As we go deeper in the mortise, we'll revert to this grip, primarily because while mortising, the chisel wants to twist at an angle as it goes down into the cut. So we'll start out with the precision grip. I'm going to start out here with the bevel facing away from me. The bevel is facing away from me. I'm going to travel in this direction, that is with the chisel going away from me. So we're going to start here and then go in this direction. You'll also notice that the chisel is leaning slightly. It's leaning away from me as well. So everything is away from me. I've got the bevel away from me, I've got the chisel leaning away from me, and I'm going to be traveling away like this. Now we're not going to start right on the line for the very reason that we talked about in some of the previous videos where the chisel acts like a wedge. So if I actually put the chisel right on the line and strike it, it's going to want to push in two directions. It's want to go this way and that way. So I'm actually going to start about a 1/16 or so away from the line, and we're going to start by making a stop cut like that. Okay. Now I'm going to advance forward about 1/8 of an inch at the most. Okay. Now you'll see what happens. What's happening here is the chisel pushes back this way, and it goes back into that cut there, relieving to allow for more cuts. You see this here? By cutting in, chisel's angled like this, and I'm changing stance here. Normally I wouldn't change the stance, but I'm just showing you here that you can see that the chisel has pushed back this way, opening up this area right in here. At this point, what I'll do is I'll actually take the chisel, bring it back like this, and then pry it forward, removing the chip. Back to the precision grip. Okay, we're going to come in like that, and then we can start getting into a rhythm here. I've kind of gone to this power grip. You can take it like this, and you'll also notice when I'm mortising that I'm not just wailing on the chisel. I'm actually listening. It's cutting, and as it gets to that point, you can almost hear it stop. Kind of changes the tone, and at that point I'm stopping, because the motion here is that every single stroke here needs to be a cutting stroke. And that's why you want to lean the chisel slightly, lean the chisel into the cut so that it's cutting in. You see this? See how I'm leaning in like this? Now look at how deep we've gone. Granted, this is pine, but in a piece of walnut, you'll go just as deep, just as fast, using the proper technique. Okay, now as we get towards the inside here, or rather to the outside line here, if I pry against the line, it's going to damage this part. Right now, if I was to look at this, inside it looks like this. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the chisel, turn it around so the bevel's facing me, and gradually remove material like this. Okay, so we're going to come in holding it at an angle like this. Okay, so you see we're holding at an angle like this. Removing a little bit of material, pull it towards me like this. And one thing that I'm not doing is I'm not starting and going straight in like that, because again, the chisel's just going to get stuck. It's not cutting. So I want to make sure here that I'm cutting with the chisel. Okay, so just like this, a little bit more, prying forward, just like so. Okay, now we're going to come in like this, and there we have it. So now what we've got, if you look at it, inside it looks like that. It comes in. I don't even mind undercutting that slightly. Okay, I'm going to set the chisel right on the mark. I'm about less than a 1/16 of an inch away from the mark, so I can set it right there on the mark and go ahead and cut it in. Now one thing you can do is you can actually come back with a 3/8 chisel, a little narrower chisel. I just go one size narrower than the mortise I'm doing. If I'm chopping a 3/8 mortise, I'll use a 1/4 inch chisel. Bevel down, come in like this, use it almost like you would a plane. Wiggle the chisel like that, and you can remove some of the waist down in there. So you see bevels down, coming in like that. Now we still have this material in there to remove. You see this is angled like this. This is nice and straight now, but this is still angled. There's a couple ways to deal with that, but I'm usually going to change my stance. So again, I'm leaning up against the bench so I can sight the chisel, making sure that it is perpendicular to the face of the bench, parallel with the side right there. And if you want to, when you're starting out here, you can even take a square, set it up on the bench like so. That way this is kind of a reference. You can see if you are going square. So use that to kind of as a training wheels to see how straight you're going. Now what I like to do is again turn it to where the bevel is facing me. Okay, the bevel's facing me, and again following that angle, we're going to slowly, gradually increase that angle, increase it to where it comes up just a little bit more till we come all the way up to where we are now 90 degrees. Okay, so now it's nice and clean, but we're not all the way back to the line. So I'm just going to keep working it a little bit more, work it back to the line, just like so. Now we'll come back with that 3/8 chisel and just clean out the waist. Now you saw what I did here. Again, granted this is pine, but you'll see I'm more than halfway through with this on almost a single pass this way. Let's just check it. Let's take the square, we'll put it in there and run it back and forth, and you can see we are that deep right there. So nice and deep. Now we can come from the other side. So we'll just take this and flip it over. Make sure your bench is clear. You don't want little shavings and whatnot to get caught there between your workpiece. I do want to show an alternative method for doing this in regards to chopping out this mortise. And I like this because you can almost form a mini mortise before you start mortising. What we'll do is we'll start by making a stop cut right there and another stop cut right there. And then you can come back with your knife and just outline the sides right here. So we're just going to outline the sides. Then you can come in with a 1-inch chisel and make a wall. Kind of like we did there with that knife wall, except this wall is with the grain. See, so we work it like that and like that. So now I've got myself a little mini mortise, if you will. So we can now take the chisel using the same technique, and I can go right to the power grip because I don't have to precision grip this anymore. I don't have to precision place this. I can just take the chisel right to this point, go in like this, and the chisel just falls right in that mortise. So one of the mistakes that I think people make here when mortising is they might not hold the chisel at the correct angle. It's important that you're about, whatever that is, about 10 degrees or so. If you go too steep like this, you're going to end up following it through and it's not going to cut effectively. If you're too straight like this, you're going to drive the chisel in, jamming it in there, and it's not going to cut. So you've got to cut about 10 degrees or so. And the other mistake that people often make is cutting off too much material in one bite. So they'll bring the chisel back here and try to cut off too much material. You want to take off only about 1/8 of an inch. You only want to advance forward about 1/8 of an inch at one time. Okay, so bring this in. Now the chisel sometimes wants to twist in the cut. Okay, so it wants to twist as you're going in. See, we're already through. And I'm counteracting that twisting action by rotation with my wrist as it's going in. So as it's going in, the chisel wants to go a little bit like this. I have to counteract that with my wrist. Okay. Now we'll just bring this down. Okay, we are all the way through, but I'm just going to clean this up by, again, turning the chisel around to where the bevel is facing me, and we'll just work this in like that. Come back from this side, do the exact same thing. I've got the chisel is now facing, the bevel rather is facing me. And there we have it. Okay, let me just bring this right up to that line, right up on the line, and there we have the mortise. Now you'll notice one thing I have not done, and that is I've not done anything to the sides. The sides have pretty much taken care of themselves. Granted, if we look down inside there, you can see, let's just take this off, try to remove some of those shavings. You can see that the sides are a little ragged inside there. So we're going to have to do something, but I don't want to widen this because then it's going to make it the wrong size. So, but I am going to clean up those sides just a little bit using the 1-inch chisel, just cleaning them up. And we'll go over to the face vise and just do that. I've got the piece secured here in my face vise, and I'm going to use the 1-inch chisel and very carefully just come in here and work straight down, gently just cleaning up the sides a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, I do not want to widen the sides, so I'm taking care here to not remove too much material. This is really just to kind of clean up some of the fuzz left over from mortising. Just cleaning that up like that. Sometimes I'll even come in like this and come straight down. Got a little bit there that needs to be removed. You can even take the chisel that you're using, the 1/2-inch chisel, stick it inside there and run it back and forth like that. That'll ensure that it is indeed 1/2 inch wide and that you have that consistent, the entire width of your mortise. Okay, so now we're just going to come in there. I did say earlier not to mortise in here, which I am just cleaning up the sides, so that is fine as long as I'm not just doing a lot of hammering and such in the vise. It's a good way to ruin your face vise, and as I mentioned, it doesn't offer any support as well. One way that I like to check my mortise, that is to make sure that this point, point A and point B, are in line with each other, is to simply stick the square inside there and check it. Now obviously I can't see if the square is making contact over here, but I can see if it's making contact over there. So all I got to do is simply turn it around and check it from this point, and I see that there's a slight gap right there. You can see that right there, a slight little gap right there. And therefore I can take and just remove a little bit of material right here, just a little bit of material. It's just a slight gap. Bring that down, and that should close that up to where it's tight. And do the same thing over here, just check it. It's making a fairly good contact, and very nice there as well. So again, I don't mind if it comes in a little bit, kind of like we did there with the dovetail, but these points have got to line up perfectly. Let's go on to cutting the tenon. What I usually like to do when cutting the tenon is to cut the shoulder first, which is the cross grain cut. Being that it's a cross grain cut, we've already scored it with a knife, but I do want to establish a knife wall. So we're going to come in with a 1-inch chisel, establish a wall there. I can use the dovetail saw to come in like this. Because the teeth are so fine, we're cutting across the grain using this dovetail saw. Dovetail saws are typically filed for rip, but being that the teeth are so small, we can actually cut across the grain. One of the things here that I want to keep in mind when I'm sawing is that I don't go past the line with the saw. Let me do an illustration here on the board just to help illustrate my point. If I have a tenon like this, and this is the part that I'm removing, and I cut in with the saw like this, and I come in from this side, you can see here the problem. What we have is we've got the saw has cut in there, and it's cut in there, and we have now a very weak tenon. So it's important here, again, not so much the sawing that's important, but the stopping of the sawing. We'll do the same thing on this side. I'm going to create that shoulder line and cut down to the line. Making sure that I don't go past the line. So now that I've cut the shoulders, there's a couple ways to remove the cheek waist. We could chisel it away or we could saw it away. One of the things, though, I want to keep in mind when chiseling it is the grain orientation. You can see here, if we follow the grain lines, like right here, this grain is actually diving in towards the tenon. So if I chisel that, it could dive in there and make the tenon angled, or even worse, ruin the tenon, making it thinner than what I want it to be. However, on this side, you can see that the grain lines are running away. They're running off like this. So it'll actually be easier to chisel this side. So I'll demonstrate that. I'll chisel this side and saw that side. I use both methods when I'm working. Sawing is a little bit harder skill. It's one that takes a little bit of time to master. So you might try both. I think chiseling is a good way, but try both methods. So I'm going to start by chiseling away the material. I'm going to start above the line. I don't want to set the chisel right in the line. I'd take off too much material, but I'm going to set the chisel above the line and kind of work it, but I'm watching the grain. Okay, I looked at the grain earlier, but I want to watch the grain as I'm working this. If I start seeing the grain dive down, I'm going to stop. So I'm just going to work this in like this, taking off a little bit more over here, watching that grain, following it through just like so. There we go. Okay, now we can come down closer to the line. Okay, just come a little bit closer down to that line. There we go. Following through with the chisel. You see how the chisel is engaged into the cut. Okay, now we can go even closer still. Now, ideally that line should represent the exact width of our mortise. If we did tend to widen our mortise, we wouldn't necessarily want to go to the depth of the line there because it would make the tenon too narrow. So that's something you want to consider. If you feel like that you may have widened this a little bit, either with the chisel to the side or even coming back like this, then you want to leave a little bit of the line. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pare this. The nice thing here is that I have that line referenced on this side, across the face there, and then on this side as well. So I can, again, go back to this hold where I pinch the chisel like this, and then working it in like this, right to where I can pare it. You can even pare it across the grain. You can go like this. This paring technique is one that requires a little bit of practice, but once you learn how to do it, it really does help in enabling you to fit a tenon accurately. Keeping that chisel controlled and paring it along. Now, you can't see, but I've got a little bit more that I've got to take off on this side. So I'm just going to work that down to the line, all the way down. Look at those shavings just curling right up. Nice sharp chisel all the way down. We're going to come across the grain like this. Watching that line, taking little cuts, paring like this. Let's inspect this now. So you can see we're a little bit above the line right there. Much more above the line over on this side. But I think that's good. We should probably leave it a little bit fat until we actually fit it. Let me show you how I saw the tenon using the rip saw. The teeth are a little bit more aggressive on a rip saw like this, and I'm not a big fan of these big 16-inch saws and such. I think they're a little bit too heavy and hard to hold on to. This is a 14-inch saw. I believe has about 12 to 13 teeth per inch, probably about 12 teeth per inch. I like it. It cuts nice, and it's filed for rip, which is what we're doing. We're ripping this. So I'm going to start like this, cut a little bit right there using, as we talked about earlier, that same technique where my thumb is there as a guide. My finger is pressing. Again, this finger is pointing out. It's pushing the saw to one side. We can lower this down. Now I can come back here to this side and just cut a little bit right there. Now we can join the two like this. Now I can work this straight down just like this, or I can lower the saw. Proper sawing technique. Look at how I'm bending at the knees. I've got my legs spread out, got my arm in line with the saw. So you see, we're working this down like this. Now let's work it down like that. Use the whole saw. Then work it down like this. Okay. Now we'll almost get to the end there. And listen to the tone lighten up on the, as we get towards the end. Hear the tone change. There it is, right there at the end. And then it just comes right off. I'm going to come back with the chisel and just clean that up. Just like that. Now let's go for the fitting of this. We know that this has to fit in like this. Okay, we know that. So if I stick this in here like this, it's a little bit tight, and I understand why. I've left more material on there. Now I see I'm pretty close to the line there, but I've got more material I've got to take off there. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back with the chisel and just chisel that down closer to the line. There we have it. That's nice. Let's check it again, making sure that... Now you see I'm checking it at an angle like this. That'll minimize the area that's actually going in. If I test it like this, I don't know exactly where the problem is. But if I test it at an angle, I can see, well, immediately I know that it's too fat in this area, and sure enough, it looks like I've got to pare it right down to my line. So that's what we'll do. We'll just go right to our line with the chisel. Now I'm going to test it at an angle like this. You can see there, that feels like it's going to go in nicely. And this feels like it's going to go in nicely like that. Now one thing I want to keep in mind here is that this is going to go all the way through. Okay, so if I'm going to make it, suppose I was going to make it come all the way through on this side here. So this would go all the way through like that. I can even notate it. Well, we'll just say that this is going to be the outside right here. It's going to go all the way through. I would actually want to fit it on the outside first. Just fit it a little ways in, making sure that it goes in on this outside area. So I see that? Goes in just nice right there. And the reason why I'm fitting it like that is because now I know that when this comes through like this side here is going to fit nicely around that outside edge. So I'm not fitting it all the way in, I'm just fitting it in a little ways. Okay. Now we'll come back to here and test it, and it looks like we probably could fit this thing all the way in. Now one thing I want to be careful of, if this is too tight, I could split this apart here. So you can actually put this in the vise to strengthen those side walls and kind of ease it in like this. It's a little bit tight. Let's take it out. You can see even where it's rubbing. You see there's a little bit of a bruise on it, a bruise spot from the fibers pressing against there, and I can actually take the chisel and just remove a little bit of material. Being cautious though not to remove material around this outside edge because we have already fit this outside edge. Looks like a little bit even on the side we could remove just a smudge there on the side. What I'm doing here is I'm just paring from about here, from this point here back this way. Again, we've already fit that outside edge, so I'm just paring that far back, and then we'll turn it over and do the exact same thing over here where we're paring from here back this way. Again, you can just take the chisel even across the grain, shearing it across the grain like this. Don't want to take too much off, just enough. And I may just even take a little bit off of the side right here. It's easier to actually pare the tenon than it is the mortise. So I prefer to pare the tenon. However, if the mortise is ragged, then I would definitely want to work on the mortise. Let's try this again. So we know there's our outside face, outside face. I'm going to put this as the outside. So this should go in like this. Let's go ahead and put it in the vise so it's strengthened. And we'll go ahead and put it in. There it is, going all the way in, nice, all the way down, just like that. And you can even take a mallet and just hit it home. I'll even take it like this, and you can see there's a little bit of a discrepancy right there, but that is just enough that you can just hand plane that. It's nice and tight all around that outside edge, which is exactly what we want.